Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Bewes. I'm delighted to be introducing this particular panel. And we have three speakers. Toril Moy teaches at Duke University. Her books include Sexual Textual Politics from 85, that's 1985. Simone de Beauvoir, The Making of an Intellectual Woman from 1994, and Henrik Ibsen and the Birth of Modernism from 2006. The publication of her latest book, Revolution of the Ordinary, Literary Studies after Wittgenstein, Austin and Cavell, is imminent. She also works on Norwegian literature and has a regular column in the Norwegian weekly Morgenbladet. Am I saying that right, Toril? And her talk is entitled Language and Attention, Morality and Literature after Wittgenstein. Nancy Yousef is a professor of English at the City University of New York, where she teaches literature and philosophy from the early 18th to the mid-19th century. Her current work deals with the intersections between aesthetics, ethics, and the history of the emotions. She's the author of two books, Isolated Cases from Cornell University Press in 2004, and Romantic Intimacy from Stanford 2013, which received the Baricelli Prize for the year's best work in Romanticism. And Helen Small is Professor of English at Oxford, where she holds the Jonathan and Julia Isbit Fellowship in English Literature at Pembroke College. Her most recent books are The Value of the Humanities from 2013 and The Long Life from 2007. Much of her work focuses on the relations between moral philosophy and theories of value, and she's in the early stages of a new project on the function of cynicism at the present time. Nancy's talk is entitled Unresolved, Attention and Form in Eliot and Wittgenstein, and Helen's talk is called Particular Attention. So we are going in that order, right, Amanda? So Toril Moy, first of all, on language and attention, morality and literature after Wittgenstein. Thanks, Toril.
Right. So first of all, I need this mic. So you can hear me now, even if I just way back there? Okay, great. I'm hoping that this paper will last no more than 30 minutes, which was my total limit, so I'm going to try to stick to that. You should have two handouts. One is the flyer for the new book. You will notice on the back you have the chapter overview, and this paper is actually a much edited and really constrained version of chapter 10. So you can see all the work that comes before this, and I've cut a lot from that. The other thing is the other handout should look something like this, and that has some quotations on it, some, not all of which I will read in the talk, so it's good to have the handout. So having said that, language and attention, morality and literature after Wittgenstein. So my paper builds on the vision of language proposed by ordinary language philosophy. By ordinary language philosophy, I mean the specific reading of Wittgenstein and Austin, pioneered and extended by Stanley Cavell. The paper is based on the last chapter in the book, so you can see all the work that has preceded it. But I will not say anything about the book because then 30 minutes will flash by. So we'll go for it. So language and attention. The capacity to use language attentively and to pay attention to language is more important than ever. We live in a world in which language has long threatened to float free of reality. Academic theories concerning signs, signifiers, and reference have contributed to the sense that words simply don't connect with anything. But by now, this situation has become intolerable. The language of politicians has increasingly been drifting free of reality. Back in 2004 already, George W. Bush's advisor Karl Rove famously now scolded the journalist Ronald Susskind for still living in a quaintly old-fashioned reality-based community, as he put it. In 2005, Stephen Colbert coined the word truthiness to convey his sense of the peculiar unreality of the political language surrounding him. When politicians, advertisers, bureaucrats, academics produce a quagmire of words that don't mean anything, their words serve one purpose: to make us acquiesce in ideas, actions, and projects we don't actually understand. This is as dangerous for intellectual life as it is for democracy. In this situation, we need a philosophically serious alternative to theories promoting the idea that language is in some fundamental way disconnected from reality, just as we need an alternative to linguistic positivism or scientism, which is the belief that words simply present reality just as it is. That alternative can be found in Wittgenstein's late philosophy. Wittgenstein was obsessed by attention. If he had been the sort of man who went in for slogans, he might have gone with attention to particulars, nice logos and so on all over his Wittgensteinian t-shirts or something. Or maybe he would have selected the simple look and see. Philosophical investigations shows that we lose our footing existentially and philosophically if we fail to pay attention to language. Ordinary language philosophy, as developed by Stanley Cavell, has also developed a strong understanding of the moral power of attention. These two things are connected, and I hope to show why. In this paper, I'll not speak much about Stanley Cavell. Instead, I'll focus on Cora Diamond's work on moral philosophy. She writes about morality, and moral philosophy. Those are the terms she uses. Sometimes morality, I think, overlaps with politics, and sometimes it does not. To figure out the connection or lack of it between politics and morality, we would need to examine a range of specific cases. So I'm not saying either that morality is politics or that political questions are always moral questions or vice versa. I think they sometimes overlap and sometimes diverge, and that's for future debate. In this paper, I'll make 3 claims, and they're on the handout. This is Austin, by the way, a sharpened awareness of words is a sharpened awareness of reality. To use words is to exercise judgment. And Cora Diamond's moral philosophy is a magnificent philosophy of attention that can only be understood in the light of the first 2 points. So I'll go straight to point 1. Sharpened awareness of words is a sharpened awareness of reality. In ordinary language philosophy, word and world are intertwined. Now, how can that be? The answer can be found in Wittgenstein's notion of use. And here I will now, for about 3/4 of a page, follow what I can only call an intense condensation of Wittgenstein's extremely simple yet incredibly challenging vision of language. So this is like shorthand or a haiku-type version of the whole thing. So words and world are intertwined in use. Use here stands as opposed to terms like representation or reference or interpretation or iterability and so on. Use gives words meaning. Use arises, a meaning arises in use. Use requires others. Use arises from shared practices and feeds back into them. Use itself is a practice carried out in a social world. Use produces meaning in a shared form of life. To speak is to use the words of a linguistic community. It's not to agree with any specific opinion or ideology in that community. But if you are to disagree or engage in ideology critique, you simply have to have some kind of agreement on what the words you're criticizing mean, or you can't get going with your critique. Use requires what Wittgenstein calls agreement in judgment, and I'll come back to that. For ordinary language philosophy, then, the act of using words, the act of saying or writing something, is always an act of judgment. We judge that these are the right words to use here in this situation to convey these specific nuances. Note, and this I will come back to at some length, use does not rely on judgment. Use reveals our judgment. It's not like judgment happens first and then you use, because then it would make no sense to say that meaning arises in use. So in the emphasis on judgment, how the ethical dimension of ordinary language philosophy arises. But utterances are not just acts and interventions. They are also expressions, so I should just say they are acts and expressions, in that way. My words reveal me. They express me. When I tell you what I see in the world, even in the most sort of intense description of something, I reveal the quality of my own attention, the scope of my own interests, at the same time as I say something about the world or about others. The quality of my attention reveals something about my moral, and sometimes also political capacities and investments. Good writing exemplifies acute attention to words in their intertwinement with the world. Literature, fiction and non-fiction alike, if it's truly well written, makes us pay attention to reality because it makes us pay attention to words. We make our lives in language. When Austin writes that a sharpened awareness of words is a sharpened attention to reality, he is thinking of all kinds of normal and natural practices. Just think of the specialist distinctions that appear to come naturally to chefs, fashion designers, farmers, and fishermen. In my book, I have a long discussion of the language of bullfights, inspired by a short story by Julio Cortázar. So you'll see which turns on how French students can't understand bullfight Spanish and get very, very angry with their dictionaries. It's a fascinating short story. But the point can be made about any human practice. So chefs, fashion designers, car mechanics, farmers, fishermen, they instantly see features that I don't even notice. I mean, when I look at the engine of my car, I see some kind of chaos. Whereas when a car mechanic does, they use all these words and tell me something about something. You see, that's my language is giving out there because my attention is giving out because I haven't paid enough attention to this. So they see features I don't even notice, both because I don't know how to do what they do and because I don't know how to talk the way they talk. The two go together. The doing and the talking are intertwined. Craftsmen and practitioners develop ways of talking that register the finest gradations in their craft, their activity, whether it's sewing, cooking, fishing, hunting, tennis, soccer, bullfighting, motorcycle repair, and so on. Every human practice gives rise to its own expressions, its own ways of speaking. The language of such practitioners, Austin writes, embodies the inherited experience and acumen of many generations. But it also constantly projects old words in new context and invents new expressions in response to new practices and technologies. To people who don't share their skills, highly experienced craftspeople appear to have uncannily heightened powers of perceptions. Experts see the world differently. They notice things that non-experts don't see, Joshua Foer writes. By expert, Foer mean people like exceptionally highly trained and experienced chess players, successful chicken sexers, and skillful police officers. And such note that such practitioners can't always explain what they do. This is not about having reasons and explanations. It's about the intertwinement of practices and words. Expert chicken sexers, for example. Now that is, the more I read about chicken sexing, the more impressed I am. Expert chicken sexers, for example, appear to have no way of explaining how they decide whether a chicken is male or female. Their art is inexplicable, Foer writes, yet someone teaches chicken sexers to see. It's a 2-year intense training course. Those teachers must say and do something to convey their art to their successors. Maybe learning chicken sexing is like learning our first language. We don't know how we learn it, yet we learn it by imitation and response, by training, by doing it, and we do it in constant interaction with others. Now, if we care about language, then we have good reason to care about literature too, not because it necessarily uplifts us and makes us better, but because writers specialize in language. Using words is their specific craft. Writers spend their lives trying to find the right words. Now, obviously, here I'm only talking about good writers. There's lots of bad writing going on. They can't teach us anything. And how do you know whether it's good or it's bad? Well, you've got to try it, right? You've got to look at it and see what happens. So writers spend their lives trying to find the right words. They can teach us differences, as Wittgenstein said. He didn't say it about writers, but he liked the phrase, I'll teach you differences. When Henry James had to give advice to writers, he didn't tell them to work hard to develop a specifically literary language. So everything I say here is like built on something in chapter 9 where I say you can't define literature and you can't define a literary language, and please give it up. That's part of what I've sort of discussed that already in the book. James simply said that they should try to notice everything, try to be one of the people on whom nothing is lost. So I see that as a call to attention. The best writers have an exceptional capacity to convey nuance, sense impressions, emotions, experiences, imaginative ruminations, reflections, thoughts. Their writing reveals and expresses the precision of their attention. Attentive writing doesn't have to be fiction. Good writing requires the capacity to think concretely, to imagine specific situations, to consider how different situations endow words with different nuances. This is not a skill limited to literature or to a particular genre of writing. I should say, it's given the context of this conference, it's above all, it's not above all, but it's a supreme skill of psychoanalytic therapy, for example, to know exactly when to say something, not to say something, and what words to choose. And to note that to use words well require imagination just as much as it requires descriptive powers. The imagination is simply try to imagine what the world might look like for the person you're trying to talk to, for example, if you're going to have some good communication going. Imagination is not just the province of fiction writers, but of everyone who tries to understand the meaning of words. You have to try to imagine what they might conceivably have meant, for example, before you conclude that it's all meaningless. Austin exhorted philosophers of all people to use their imagination. He said that what we need to do to understand what something means is, quote, to imagine the situation in detail with a background of story, and to imagine cases with vividness and fullness. Those things go for philosophers as well as for writers and for every one of us. So now I'll turn to the idea that to use words is to exercise judgment. Now, this may be a more sort of philosophical part of the paper, but I think it's crucial to try to understand what the claim here is and what it is not. So I'll do it, as it were. This is one of Wittgenstein's and indeed Cavell's most fundamental insights. Now, why is this such an important idea? It may help to contrast it with two much better known and still widely influential views of language. And the first one is positivistic or scientistic visions of language, where language is considered a kind of neutral presentation of facts, a value-free registration of phenomena. The Saussurean and the post-Saussurean tradition, which has been dominant in the literary humanities for generations, considers language to be a closed system of differences. In this view, language, because it's a closed system, is fundamentally unconnected to reality. This produces a theoretical problem for theorists in this tradition, because they now have to spend a lot of time proposing theories to explain how it is that words nevertheless sometimes appear to connect with the world. Some argue, of course, that there's no connection, that the signifier always floats free of the signified. Others claim that there are, mostly the signifiers float around, but there are some anchoring points that occasionally pins the signifier onto the world. Yet others again propose quite complex theories intended to explain how it is that words mean anything. And these theories have names like interpretation. You know, you need a mechanism of interpretation to connect the empty signifier with the whatever meaning it might have. Or iterability in Derrida is another stab at the same problem. Performativity, yet another stab at the same problem. I just can't go into this here, but I do in the book why this is a non-problem for Wittgenstein. You only end up having to solve the problem of how words connect to reality if you posit that they are separate in the first place. If you start with the language practice, words and world intertwined, that's just not the issue. I know it takes a long time to truly feel how that works, but it's true, I guarantee you. I'm going to skip a little bit. But so in the post-Saussurean tradition, in sort of later versions of it, it has become quite common now to praise Saussure for having realized a fully post-human vision of language. That is, a vision in which speakers and judgment are quite irrelevant. In many ways, the two traditions I mentioned, positivism, the post-Saussureans, contrast sharply. The post-Saussurean tradition is skeptical. It insists on the political, historical, and social embeddedness of language. In this tradition, no utterance is value-free. The positivistic tradition, on the other hand, takes language to be neutral and objective, a vehicle for the transmission of facts. But note that both traditions share one underlying picture of language, which is that language for them is a system or a practice, whatever they think it is, in which individual speakers are irrelevant for the constitution of meaning. Because positivists don't think it matters who speaks, because you're just registering whatever's there. And for the post-structuralists, obviously the system of language doesn't depend on a specific speaker, so they actually come together on this point. For Wittgenstein, Austin, and Cavell, words are not simply signs referring to or failing to refer to reality. To them, it makes no sense to think of language as a system without speakers. For them, meaning arises in use, understood as a shared human practice. Every speech act, even those that utter scientific claims, takes place against the background of shared judgment. Wittgenstein writes famously in paragraph 242, it is not only agreement, and here the German word is Übereinstimmung, so think of attunement, tuning, Stimmung, mood even. So it's not only agreement in definitions, but also, odd as it may sound, agreement in judgments that is required for communication by means of language, Wittgenstein writes. To agree in judgment, Cavell helps us grasp more fully. So this, what's coming now is sort of Cavellian. To agree in judgment is to share criteria for when and how to apply concepts. We have criteria for how to use words such as cat or dog, or words like reluctant or eagerly. Use is not random or accidental. It's governed by criteria. But, and here's the problem, there's a great article by Stephen Affeldt that explains how criteria work for Cavell and Wittgenstein. Governed by doesn't mean that criteria is some kind of metaphysical or ontological entity that exists before the act of speaking. Criteria are not rules that provide a ground of intelligibility for words. The whole language of ground of meaning is alien to this tradition I'm talking about here. The wonder of human language, Cavell notes, is precisely that it does not depend on such a structure of and conception of rules as grounding. Criteria don't underpin or ground language. Criteria and language are, as it were, two perspectives on the same utterance. Agreement in language and agreement in criteria, two ways of describing the same thing. And this is where we're coming to that long quote on page 1, the Cavell quote, number 2 on page 1 there. Criteria don't exist apart from the specific situation, apart from the specific occasion of asking and the specific need which our asking is to address. Now, Cavell goes on to describe that in that long quote. It's very important here to see that okay, so the claim is that all our knowledge is governed not just by we understand as evidence or truth conditions. If we did that, we would be on the more scientific part of things, but by criteria. And Cavell then says, he uses the phrase not merely. That's a misleading emphasis. Criteria are not alternatives or additions to evidence. It's not, you don't choose between facts on the one hand and criteria on the other. Without the control of criteria in applying concepts, we wouldn't even know what counts as evidence for any claim, nor for what claims evidence is needed. Now, I'm itching to give some examples and practical considerations here, but if I do that, you know, my poor co-panelists wouldn't feel good. So I'm going to not do that, but we can discuss later. So there's a kind of, but put it this way, if I go around, if I set up a fancy MRI scanning test of your brain, and I'm looking to see what happens when I say the word tea to you as opposed to the word coffee, I'm already taking completely for granted all kinds of things, maybe we do with words and things like tea and coffee, in my very hypothesis that this is worth MRI scanning and so on. You see, I see that sort of thing. Anyway, facts therefore remain facts, but we couldn't establish facts unless we shared the background of necessities and agreement that make up our form of life. Criteria do not precede judgment. If they did, they would be a ground of language. We discover, lay bare, uncover our criteria by investigating what we say, but we don't investigate our language all the time. We do it when we have a problem, so that when we say things like, what? What do you mean? That's a case of calling for criteria very often. So the stunning systematicity of language reveals itself in the discovery, the fact that we share criteria for what to say when. That's why so many conversations work so fine. I mean, we seem to get it, and then we don't call for criteria. Maybe we should sometimes. We have, in fact, misunderstood each other, but, you know, we discover that later, maybe. To speak, then, is to utter something against a background of shared judgment. This is why Cavell emphasizes the concept of voice, which stresses the inescapable element of subjectivity in every human utterance. And here, note, subjectivity does not stand in opposition to objectivity. It signals rather that so-called objectivity is something we achieve in language. It doesn't mean that you can't have, I will still criticize you for giving a blatantly biased account of this and a fair-minded account of that, but that's in language that we do those things. So it's crucial to understand that this is not an attempt to collapse facts into values. And quote 3 is about that, but I'll skip that here. This emphasis on the subject's judgments at work in every utterance enables ordinary language philosophy to move us beyond both linguistic skepticism, which is the sense that language never grasps the world, that it floats free of the world, and various kinds of scientism and positivism, the idea that only a certain kind of objective scientific language provides true knowledge. Language itself makes no judgment. Note how many articles you will read about language doing this, that, and the other. For Wittgenstein and Austin and Cavell, language doesn't do anything. We do. Language doesn't make judgments. We make judgment in use. We are responsible for our words, and responsibility is a moral and ethical and political concept. So that gets me to Cora Diamond's moral philosophy of attention. Obviously, I would have liked to spell out her debt to Simone Weil and Iris Murdoch, and particularly to spell out Diamond's understanding of Murdoch's ideal of the just and loving gaze, which I've come to like more and more. But there's no time for that here. So I'll just say that for Cora Diamond, moral reflection is a specific kind of attention, a particular response to the world, a way of seeing things, the world, seeing other people, seeing oneself. For her, moral philosophy must focus on the particular case, on the individual, the specific, and the unique. Murdoch writes that there are moral attitudes which emphasize the inexhaustible detail of the world, the endlessness of the task of understanding, and Diamond agrees deeply with that. We never finish the work of understanding. As the best literature demonstrates, there's always more to see. As an example, Diamond quotes the last stanza of Ducks. Now, this is on page 2 or the back page of your handout. It's a children's poem. It's like got 6 or 7 stanzas, and it talks about ducks, different types of ducks. And then, this is the last stanza quoted by Diamond. All these are kinds, but every duck himself is, and himself alone. Fleet wing, arched neck, webbed foot, round eye, and marvelous cage of bone. Clad in this beauty, a creature dwells of sovereign instinct, sense, and skill. Yet secret as the hidden wells, whence life itself doth rill. Now that last line is awful in my opinion, but it nevertheless, the poem shows in a very simple way that a duck is a creature of beauty and dignity, deserving of respect and admiration. Diamond wants us to see that there's something morally important about the quality of the poet's attention to a common duck. The stanza is an example of a just and loving gaze. It's an example, I mean, you see, there's no action involved here. This is important for Diamond and Murdoch, that there's a way of seeing things and a way of finding words for what you see that embodies your stance. It exemplifies, this stanza, the intertwinement of language and attention. Now, in the chapter that this is taken from, I discuss writers like Ibsen, Rilke, Woolf, Vigdis Hjorth, and others, but here I don't do that at all. I'll just mention Ted Hughes briefly. But Diamond disagrees with the widespread idea that moral reflection always takes the form of a deliberation on clear-cut choices or explicit evaluations, right, wrong, evil, good. Traditional moral philosophy, she writes, takes a far too narrow view of what count as morally relevant insights. And the famous trolley problem is a quintessential example. Here's one version in case. I was very lucky when I first started reading these things because I had somehow missed the trolley problem, and then I had to learn about the trolley problem, and then I had to learn that that wasn't really worth learning. But anyway, one version of the trolley problem is a runaway railway trolley comes down the railway line. If nothing is done, it will kill 5 workers further down the track. I'm standing on a bridge over the track next to a very fat man. Should I push this stranger down on the line in order to save the 5 workers? And there are millions of versions of this. This way of setting up the question of morality turns morality into something added to already existing knowledge. It sort of purifies the moment of morality to the moment of choice. Morality becomes a moral icing on an already existing cake. But Diamond objects, and I can't go into her deep reasons for this, which are totally Wittgensteinian, but she objects to the idea that epistemology and metaphysics provide the framework for what we can say about reality, and then once that framework is in place, moral philosophy can step in and tell us what's to count as good or evil, right or wrong. This view reduces morality to the question of how to label people and their actions, and divorces it from questions concerning truth and insight, because those questions are taken to be settled before the moral inquiry begins. She reminds us that moral action only rarely takes the form of a clear choice in which we sit down and make lists of arguments for and against. In real life, we often are in experiences like we feel we have no choice, or we discover that we actually already have done something with huge moral implications without really thinking about it. And then sometimes we make long lists of arguments, consider them carefully, decide what to do, and then we go out and do exactly the opposite, just without thinking, or we do nothing. And in all these cases, the trolley problem is of no help whatsoever. In short, when it comes to explaining the kind of moral reasoning we actually engage in everyday life, the trolley problem and that kind of way of thinking of morality is not very helpful. First, it's overly focused on dramatic choices. Second, it divorces the question of moral action from the question of how we see the world. It assumes that the way of seeing what is the case precedes the words, the judgments we make about them. And everything I'm saying here is to say, no, the judgment, the morality, the problem is in the very act of seeing. Attention and judgment and words go together. So if morality requires a certain kind of attention, a certain way of seeing, and we need to find words to express that way of seeing, then, of course, the best writers have a lot to teach us. And now I'm going to come to the sort of end and peroration here, which is to talk a little about Diamond's notion of the difficulty of reality. So to devote one's full attention to a phenomenon or a person, and to find a language in which to express what we see is difficult. Even when we do our best, others may never understand us. Sometimes we are overcome by our own inadequacy. We simply can't find the words. We turn away. We don't want to pay attention. Diamond writes about the difficulty of reality, which she defines as something we aren't capable of thinking about, something we can't express in words, maybe because it's too painful, maybe because it's inexplicably good. Now, I should say I started working on this chapter in the aftermath of the horrendous Utøya massacre in Norway, and there's quite a bit about that in the actual chapter, but I'm not going there, but there's an underlying sense that something happens. You need words to name this thing in reality. You need to pay attention, and yet it's too awful. You don't know how to do it, and that's what the difficulty of reality comes in. This is a phrase, Diamond writes, for experiences in which we take something in reality to be resistant to our thinking it, or possibly to be painful in its inexplicability, difficult in that way, or perhaps awesome and astonishing in its inexplicability. We take things so, and the things we take so may simply not to others present the kind of difficulty of being hard or impossible or agonizing to get one's mind around. Note that Diamond here is totally breaking with conventional trauma theory. She's not just talking about traumas, by the way, but inexplicably good things as well. And even when she does talk about traumatic experiences, she doesn't share the widespread conviction that trauma always, quotes, falls outside language. To think that, you need to believe that language is a closed system. You need to picture it as a kind of spatial thing, which of course language is action and practice. What would it be to be outside that? You can see that that whole outside language discourse is based on the Saussurean vision of language, but that's an aside. So to her, note that the difficulty of reality is something that has to do with the way we take it. It's just like when we speak, we make judgment. It's not language speaking for us. We speak. And here, where we can't find the words, where we find that reality is too difficult, we can't say it, it's the problem of the unsayable. It's not a thing that's unsayable. What's unsayable won't be the same for everyone. Someone else will breeze in and say, oh, that's nothing. I don't see why you get so upset about that. She has some good examples of that. So this difficulty of reality can't be turned into a theory, is another way of saying this. All we can do is to investigate the particular case, to follow to make an attempt to acknowledge the experience that's being conveyed to us by paying attention to it. So then Diamond gives a wonderful example of the poem by Ted Hughes, which I will also skip here. And then I will just say that the reason why Diamond uses literary examples and why we should use more is that the right kind of attention isn't simply just a cool clinical noting down of features of reality. Truly to get inside the experiences of the other is difficult. To convey the full complexity of a situation is just as hard. Such tasks require us to mobilize our powers of imagination, compassion, identification, alongside our powers of reflection and reason. These are the skills of language and imagination developed by the best writers. My argument note is not at all that reading literature makes us better people, because if that were true, all literature professors ought to be moral paragons. But I've spent my life in literature departments, and somehow I'm not convinced yet. I'm simply saying that the best writers can teach us how to pay attention to language. I'm also saying that there are strong philosophical reasons to take their practice with words seriously. If word and world are intertwined, if meaning arises in use and use reveals judgment, then a sharpened attention to words is a sharpened attention to reality. We need to train our attention so as to be able to tell when words are used to obfuscate reality and when they float free of reality altogether. A society that loses faith in language, so this argument is all an argument against what I call linguistic skepticism, which, came in with modernism, I think, and has lasted for about 130 years at least. Anyway, a society that rejects the very idea of a just and loving gaze, an attentive gaze in Diamond's sense, as so much unscientific sentimentalism, will necessarily go on to try to replace judgment with measurements. In such a society, leaders won't ask themselves if they have truly looked at the situations for which they are responsible. Instead, they will proceed as if rules, benchmarks, and checklists abolish the need for human judgment. When disaster strikes, they will hide behind their rules and regulations and their vague, lifeless, and peculiarly impersonal language. They will forget that, as Hannah Arendt once said, man's faculty of judgment rules out blind obedience. When we ask what such leaders take responsibility for, their answers will certainly make us feel that reality is slipping through our fingers. In a world in which so many powerful people and institutions have a vested interest in making us lose faith in language's power to respond to and reveal reality, precise and attentive use of words is an act of resistance. In Politics and the English Language, George Orwell declares that one ought to recognize that the present political chaos is connected with the decay of language, and that one can probably bring about some improvement by starting at the verbal end. In such a situation, every imaginatively crafted sentence, every perceptive reflection, every clear formulation, and every accurate description is a small victory. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to try to angle this so that you can hear me and so that I can also reach the screen. So let's see how that works. Okay. Is the projector on? Yeah, okay. All right. This talk is divided into 3 parts. Let me see if I can move the computer closer. Can you hear me? We good? I'm going to project first a long piece of text. No need to try to take it fully in at this point, just to register maybe that it's familiar. I'll also say that as I proceed, I'll occasionally project pieces of text that I don't directly discuss. They're in conversation with the material of the paper, and hopefully will be helpful rather than just distracting, although it may just be distracting. So part 1, a woman is crying. I'm sure everyone here will recognize what is probably the most famous passage in Middlemarch, one that is memorable in itself and also seems to crystallize the profundity of the book, its aspirations, the affecting humility of its boldest insights. This is a paper about loosening the powerful grip of this passage and trying to see that the novel is always showing something, even when it seems to be explaining what it shows. I do not mean by this that I'm resisting the authority of the narrator. The narrator extends a guiding hand, and I still take the hand in mine, not to be guided this time, but to arrest the movement, as if to say, I'm not sure of this path forward, let's keep looking about. You know from my title that Wittgenstein will be joining this discussion. He's already here, urging hesitation. A philosophical problem has the form, I don't know my way about, which I take as a caution that the drive to find a clear direction might itself be problematic, that turning around might also be a way of proceeding. Certainly one path taken in this passage leads away from the woman who is crying. To what is our attention being drawn instead? If we had keen vision and feeling of all ordinary life, it would be like hearing the grass grow. The analogy is remarkable for seamlessly compounding figuration and hypothesis, the unheard sound of growing grass metaphorically representing the unsensed thoughts and feelings of others, but also indicating that the limits of emotional sensibility are like the limits of sense perception. And these limitations are sublime. The difference between the coarse emotion of mankind and a keen vision and feeling is vast. The analogy conjures up a criterion no one can meet, and the impossibility hardly seems conciliated by the assurance that our frames could hardly bear it. But is this fatalistic rendering, and it's literally fatal, right? We should die, the only way to imagine what it would entail to have keen vision and feeling of ordinary life? If I'm moved by the figure, must I also follow the speculative path indicated by it? The analogy sublimes what Stanley Cavell calls disappointments in our occasions of knowing one another, a pivotal moment in his own effort to wrest the realistic features of human misunderstanding from the surreal ramifications of traditional philosophical skepticism. Eliot's analogy offers an explanation of these disappointments, but one that deflects attention away from the feeling of disappointment just as surely as it moves away from the woman crying, pointing instead toward an ideal of keen vision and feeling and away from the element of tragedy attached to the thought that we do not expect people to be deeply moved by what is not unusual. And this is where I want to continue to look about. What is not unusual is usually not deeply moving. Vision and feeling of ordinary life are ordinarily not keen. Even as I find myself implicated in these remarks, accepting the hand extended by the narrator, I also feel rushed away from the difficulty by what follows. The sense that we ordinarily fail to find ordinary life meaningful is the motivating insight, but quickly bypassed. It is easy to agree, to nod a demurral as if the remark, or maybe it's a complaint, requires no more than passive assent. I'll be returning to Middlemarch at the end of the talk, and specifically to the problem of recognizing what calls for response in the novel, what counts as a question, and what passes for explanation. The middle section to which I now turn offers the broader framework within which I understand the provocations to attentive engagement actuated by the form of this novel, especially by the purposefully unresolved variances between occasions for knowing it dramatically presents and the conceptual tendency of its narrator's guiding insights. So part 2, the urgency of the everyday. My current project, the aesthetic commonplace, attempts to establish coherent connections between three distinct appeals to the everyday as the vital yet somehow always overlooked site of meaningful engagement with others. And now, given Heather's question, I might have to abandon the project. William Wordsworth's proposal to choose incidents and situations from common life, to describe them in plain language, and above all, to make them interesting, is probably the most memorable such declaration. A half-century after Wordsworth, George Eliot renewed this appeal in her earliest fiction, most openly in a manifesto-like chapter she placed at the center of her first full-length novel, Adam Bede, which is written in 1859 but set in 1799 with the first edition of lyrical ballads appearing as one character's gift to another. Eliot's knowledge of Wordsworth was deep, so her evocation of the poet's aesthetic of everydayness is hardly surprising. But it is also strange, given Wordsworth's presence in her writings, that Eliot would have her narrator defend artistic commitment to common coarse people and commonplace things, as if that were a novel, original task and not a reminder of what Wordsworth had earlier proposed. My intuition is that the coherence of this appeal depends on the gesture of awakening to a suddenly imperative mission. Something is stipulated by the willful urgency of the call to see the everyday as overlooked. The affective inflection is intrinsic to the demand, not stylistically incidental, and I'll return to that note of urgency in a moment. For both Wordsworth and Eliot, the task of making ordinary things interesting seems to suspend the distinction between description and invention, and to subsume them under the term recollection, which is to say that attending to the everyday entails discovering nothing new, nothing unknown, nothing we haven't already seen. It is in precisely these terms, as an assembling of recollections and not a hunt for new facts, that the 20th century philosopher most associated with the everyday describes his method. Wittgenstein enters this discussion of 19th century literary aesthetics abruptly today. There's no time for the justification of a detailed intellectual history. I'll simply state directly that the philosopher's resolution to stick to matters of everyday thought in the philosophical investigations needs to be read alongside the aesthetic statements of the Romantic poet and the realist novelist as a significant inheritance of their aspirations in order to understand the conceptual and ethical implications of the commitment to the ordinary as a neglected region of meaning. At stake for all three is the sense that certain forms of knowledge fail to accommodate features of experience that press upon us too closely, too frequently, and too particularly to be systematically understood. In that way, these appeals form part of a broader 19th century debate about the value of abstraction, the efficacy of generalization, and the significance of particularity or detail. The intersection with the theme of this conference involves not only the emphatic call for attention to the everyday, but also the weird coupling of the assurance that attending to the everyday involves just seeing what's there, and the insistence that this just seeing is not so easy, that temptations and resistances obscure and obstruct. In suggesting that tonal urgency is intrinsic to the appeal, I mean also to indicate that its repetition is always a renewal, never a claim to originality, more an exclamation of something suddenly remembered, immediate, and of the moment. I draw attention to this feature in order to keep in focus the dialogic form of the appeal, especially in Elliot and Wittgenstein, where advocacy for a certain practice does not proceed by theoretical justification or defense, but instead conjures up interlocutors and calls for response and assent. In emphasizing this structure of address, I am also suggesting that the call to attend to the everyday entails an approach or methodology, and not an effort to direct attention to or identify some category of overlooked objects or persons or phenomena. And here, I'm not so much dissenting as just veering away, moving to the side, of an ample body of scholarship in which the aesthetics of the everyday is understood to involve an elevation of low or vulgar or humble subjects into the dignified region of art. That transvaluation is indeed important for the history of art, taste, and realism in the 19th century, But so long as the appeal to the everyday is primarily associated with the represented content of art, then it is also confined to a framework in which predictable questions come begging, concerns about instrumentalization and the casting of classes of things and persons into ethically edifying service. To take just a recent example, even Jane Bennett's important work on everydayness and enchantment, which I think is very interesting, can't seem to get off the ground without a dense theoretical defense against charges of quietism or ideological blindness. And such a defense is actually necessary insofar as the ethics associated with the everyday foregrounds sensory receptivity and appears attached in that way to particular ideas of everyday things. On my understanding, the appeal to the everyday, its tonal urgency, its structure of address, are arresting precisely because the objects of attention are worrisomely indeterminate, defined as no more and no less than the near at hand yet overlooked. That very indeterminacy alerts us to the possibility, indeed insists on the possibility, that we do not yet know where or how to look or what to say about it. The appeal depends on responsive concurrence to the sense that something obviously important and important because obvious has gone unnoticed, but that concurrence does not magically bring the thing to light. How then does the urgent appeal and the agreement it elicits constitute a form of attention that is at the same time irresolute and unclear about its object? Today I'm going to give this question some concreteness, or try to, by proposing a formal correspondence between two radically different texts, George Eliot's Middlemarch and Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. The cultural worlds of these writers are more proximate than might appear, linked by mid to late 19th century debates internal to philosophy in England, by the legacy of empiricism, the development of logic as an academic discipline, and an ongoing preoccupation with the relationship between science and art. So that's a big history for another occasion, and I only mention it to say that the connections that I'm trying to propose between Eliot and Wittgenstein aren't really just arbitrary or coincidental. I think they have a historical grounding. I'll mention first the evident centrality in each of the problem of other minds, the idea that there is an essential and irremediable disjunction between what I can know of myself and what I can know of others. In Middlemarch, the epistemic limits inherent to individuation, the ethical and emotional consequences of those limits are the narrator's recurrent theme, the subject of her most elaborate reflections, the basis for what might be termed her theory of human misunderstanding. This problem pervades the investigations as well, most obviously in the series of remarks that have come to be known as the private language argument, but elsewhere throughout the work and in the many lectures and notebooks composed in the preceding years. Superficially, there would seem to be a clear difference of attitude between the novelist and the philosopher on the problem of other minds. For Eliot's narrator, being blind or insensible to the inward troubles of another simply follows from the fact that each one of us has a center of self from whence the light and shadows must always fall with a certain difference. A passing observation, such as each lived in a world of which the other knew nothing, is typical of the voice animated by that idea of radically distinct inwardness. In this particular case from the novel, and in many others, nothing especially impressive or dramatic has transpired in the preceding scene to motivate the judgment. But the existential conviction underlying it has so frequently been expressed that it's easy to glide over another articulation of the notion that our inner worlds are hidden from one another. The strangeness of what Wittgenstein would call its picture of human life, and the even stranger failure to let it pass as if it were an edifying insight and not a catastrophic vision, is attenuated by its repetition in the familiar, sympathetic voice of the narrator. Formally, Wittgenstein's orchestration of differently voiced remarks on the privacy of sensation and experience seems to offer no such comfort or guidance, and substantively, those remarks can all too easily be seen as amounting to a denial of psychic inwardness altogether. Each lived in a world of which the other knew nothing is precisely the kind of sentence that a certain kind of reader would imagine Wittgenstein exposing as metaphysical nonsense. But I think that view of Wittgenstein as the deconstructor of private experience has been superseded. Readers more attentive to the sympathetically diagnostic work being done in his writing, and I'm thinking of Cavell here, also of Cora Diamond, Jim Conant, Stephen Mulhall, among many others. Readers who are appropriately wary of translating its formal complexity into a discursive line of argument find in the investigations no denial that phrases such as each lived in a world of which the other knew nothing or no one else can really know how I feel are meaningful. But there is a denial that they convey information, which is related to the aim of making a radical break with the idea that language always functions in one way, always serves the same purpose. No one can know how painful this is. They live in different worlds. He never knows what is in my mind. These are what Wittgenstein, speaking diagnostically, comes to describe as expressions and exclamations. But it is difficult to recall and tempting to avoid thinking of them as such, easier to drift away from the occasion that elicits them, to be captivated by the picture of unreachable inwardness that seems to explain their meaning. Problems arising through a misinterpretation of our forms of language have the character of depth, Wittgenstein notes, which is not to say that their resolution involves an exposure of false depth, but an acknowledgement of the deep disquietudes shaping them. He never knows what is in my mind. The aim, I think, is to attend to the occasion in which we would like so much to say something like this, are irresistibly inclined to say it, without being forced into an assumption about its ramifications. How then are we to attend to everyday expressions of those disappointments in our occasions of knowing one another, to take heed of them and resist subliming them? I said earlier that tonal urgency is constitutive of the appeal to the everyday. At the very least, the affective inflection makes it impossible to forget that the appeal is issued as an address, elicits concurrence, but doesn't point out or point to the obvious overlooked thing, the overlooking of which motivated the appeal in the first place. Let me now give some indication of the kind of engagement that this urgent but indeterminate appeal demands. Part 3, expecting a response without forming a question. So the most distinctive feature of the investigations, the philosophical investigations, is its composition as a contention among different voices. There are debate-like episodes in which one voice seems to prevail over its interlocutors, but read as a whole, multiple, distinctly inflected voices offer generative insights without any one emerging as authoritative. I want to propose that George Eliot shares with Wittgenstein not only the urgently articulated appeal to the everyday, and not only a related preoccupation with the deep disquietudes hushed under the label, the problem of other minds, but also the deployment of a polyvocal form that provokes successive rethinking of the assumptions shaping its most powerful figures of human misunderstanding. The apparent coherence of the extreme view of individuation and privacy voiced by Eliot's narrator is as much in need of engaged interrogation as the simplified view of Wittgenstein's rejection of interiority. A web is woven, but I'm not sure the novel calls on us to repair it in the places where we find it torn. To suggest that Middlemarch is formed by a contention among different voices, none of which are authoritative, means relinquishing the hold of one of the book's most beloved features, the warm and brilliant reflections of its distinctive narrator, its wisest voice, its confiding intelligence. It means demoting Eliot's narrator, omniscient narrator, I think there are many narrators, but it means demoting Eliot's omniscient narrator from the position of theorist of the novel to that of a theorist in the novel. And for me, at least, this has not been a purely intellectual exercise. It has been difficult to relinquish insights conveyed in cherished passages and instead pause to ask whether their character of depth obscures rather than illuminates the deeper disquietudes that are in plain view throughout the novel. So in the time remaining, I'll offer just one example of how the novel provokes an interrogative reorientation, even as its narrator provides resolution to questions that deflect attention away from what seems most obvious and least unusual in the deeply moving and undeniably ordinary scenes of domestic tension it relates. So the moment in which the heroine is discovered alone and in tears during her honeymoon inspires the remarkable passage about the roar on the other side of silence with which I began. That moment is the fulcrum around which several richly detailed chapters of the novel unfold, dilating temporally through the days and hours preceding it, with the focalization in the heroine's psyche punctuated by narration of a series of restrained yet exceedingly tense exchanges between the disastrously ill-suited newlywed couple. On the very morning preceding the tearful afternoon, Dorothea's naive, importuning interest in her husband's work inadvertently aggravates his anxious insecurity, each touching unperceived vulnerabilities in the other, and each roused to an indignation in which neither of them felt it possible to speak again. In this uncomfortable intimacy within which silence itself is audible, as the withholding of speech, within which the slightest withdrawal would feel like a violent rebuff, they abide together, the wife accompanying her husband to the Vatican as usual, leaving him at the library, and then entering the adjacent museum because she had not the spirit to turn round. So we won't follow her there, though it is worth mentioning that her morning at the museum is as much a fulcrum for these chapters as her tearful afternoon, and there's a lot to be said about that. But what I'm interested in now is the point at which the story does finally move forward in time, past the tearful afternoon, to bring husband and wife together again. Affectively, no time has passed. She is anxious, he is weary, and her words recall the angry parting by plainly beseeching reconciliation. So after it has been impossible to speak, this is one way to resume conversation. Forgive me for speaking so hastily to you this morning. I was wrong. I fear I hurt you and made the day more burdensome. I'm glad that you feel that, my dear. He spoke quietly and bowed his head a little, but there was still an uneasy feeling in his eyes as he looked at her. But do you forgive me, said Dorothea with a quick sob. In her need for some manifestation of feeling, she was ready to exaggerate her own fault. My dear Dorothea, who with repentance is not satisfied is not of heaven or earth. You do not think me to be worthy of that severe sentence, said Mr. Casaubon, exerting himself to make a strong statement and also to smile faintly. Dorothea was silent, but a tear which had come up with the sob would insist on falling. So without anger, here's the whole full passage. Without anger, without overt disagreement, without open hostility, the other's need may nevertheless be repulsed, expectations unmet, wounds inflicted. Perhaps this is one element of tragedy which lies in the fact of frequency, and surely it is remarkable that the human frame does bear so much of it. When the narrator enters the scene, it is with a hand extended, I would say, to guide us through and past this difficult moment. Her remarks condense the heroine's distress, situate it within a broader analysis of ethical failing, and conclude with a memorably abstract figure for the Enlightenment to be wrested from disillusionment. Today, she had begun to see that she had been under a wild illusion in expecting a response to her feeling from Mr. Casaubon, and she felt the waking of a presentiment that there might be a sad consciousness in his life which made as great a need on his side as on her own. We are all of us born in moral stupidity, taking the world as an udder to feed our supreme selves. Dorothea had early begun to emerge from that stupidity, but yet it had been easier to her to imagine how she would devote herself to Mr. Casaubon than to conceive, with that distinctness which is no longer reflection but feeling, an idea wrought back to the directness of sense, like the solidity of objects, that he had an equivalent center of self, whence the light and shadows must always fall with a certain difference. What does it mean to discover, as if it were previously unknown, that others have a center of self, a sad consciousness within? Is the narrator proposing that we, as a matter of course, live together, converse, tell stories, trade goods, share meals, play games, but that it takes some extraordinary revelation to make the other's inwardness real in the way that solid objects are real? Is this the sound of the grass growing, if not as a roar, then at least as a gentle murmur? Everything about this passage is consistent with the narrator's theorization of privacy and intersubjective opacity, and the assumptions informing it are worth specifying. the ontological priority of a single subject or mind, the supreme self that is our birthright and our dark enclosure, the inner dimension and hidden depth of the self, a consciousness, be it sad or happy, that I know from my own experience but might only guess at in others, the tendency to conceive and consequently to represent and explain the limitations of response to others, our moral stupidity, as an epistemological constraint or limitation, that certain difference between how the light and shadows fall for you and for me. To read this concluding and seemingly conclusive revelation as itself a kind of event in the novel, rather than a definitive interpretation of events in the plot, is part of what I mean by understanding the novel as a contention among different voices and perspectives. And by event, I literally mean that something occurs here. Not a movement forward in the plot, but a turn away from the occasion that prompts this particular reflection. As in the famous passage with which I began, attention is deflected from a woman who is crying. Again, disappointment with our ordinary occasions of knowing one another is at issue. And again, the narrator extends an eloquent invitation to accept a picture of an existentially fated constraint or obstruction. We are all born in moral stupidity, and if, as we have already been told, most of us walk around well wadded with stupidity, then woe betide any of us who expect a response to our feeling. I want to say that the narrator provides a kind of explanation for the defeated expectation here, and in so doing looks away from what the novel has just brought into plain view, feelings of repulsion, frustration, disappointment, for which there is no ready resolution. It is not just any response to her feeling that Dorothea feels she can no longer expect. If feeling is a kind of question put to another, then an answer may be given or withheld or misunderstood or evaded, and all of these are forms of response. Expectation and response are terms of exchange, forming the contours of a space in which one and the other are held together, for better or worse. But in drawing inward to expose the waking of a presentiment in Dorothea about the other's existential separateness, the narrator is also retreating from that shared space in which expectation and response are co-created. If I see someone writhing in pain with evident cause, I do not think, all the same, his feelings are hidden from me. Dorothea's disappointment and Casaubon's failure are not epistemic. The quick sob that rises with Dorothea's plea for reassurance, but you do forgive me, and the tear which had come up with the sob and insists on falling are plainly expressive. And if this tear that escapes is not wiped away by the other's hand, is that not itself a response? Casaubon has, in fact, all along been responding to Dorothea's feeling in the painful scene between them. The tragic element of what occurs consisting precisely in being made to see that just this weariness, impatience, resentment are his responses to her feeling. Perhaps it helps then to imagine or to have it explained that the comforting hand is withheld because the other might not know that the tear is a sign of the sad consciousness within. How much more difficult to just look and not think, and so to see that the withheld hand is as explicit an expression of feeling as the tear. The alienation between husband and wife at this moment could not then be so readily composed into a definitive illustration of the existential distance between minds, but would instead have to be withstood as an all too common form of intimacy. In this way, the novel brings us to see how Dorothea comes to learn that Casaubon always said "my love" when his manner was the coldest. If one goal of the investigations is to bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use, and nevertheless these combinations of words, "he never knows what is in my mind," means something, then something, if not a resolution, can only be arrived at by recalling their humble home in language, a procedure that requires successively entering into a range of genuinely felt disappointments, resisting the impulse to formulate a big question, remaining on the rough ground between expectation and response, always turning around the real needs expressed in small questions. Thank you.
same thing, you can't see the screen from there.
Just a moment.
I think you must all be fighting for attention at the moment. It's the kind of challenge going forward. I'm going to be nearer the 20-minute than the 30-minute mark, you might be relieved to hear. I had lunch with a friend in New York yesterday who looked with applause at the program and asked me what my paper was about. And when I said it was about Wittgenstein and Iris Murdoch, he responded, "I do not know why your interest in British philosophy has not hurt you more." So this is the voice of the discipline from on high. I don't think it's as true here as he thought it was. This is a paper about paying attention to things that other people don't think you should be paying attention to. Iris Murdoch's classic essay, The Idea of Perfection, 1964, pursues an answer to a technical question within philosophy. Should the kind of thinking that goes on in our heads when we're reflecting morally count as moral activity, even when it does not in any way escape the confines of our heads? Elaborating on the strict internality to be imagined here, Murdoch reaches for hypothetical examples. I was at first tempted to take a case of ritual, she says. Actually, I'll save that for a second. An outer framework which both occasions and identifies an inner event. A case, in other words, that could give a formal context to what may or may not be going on vividly to ourselves inside our heads as we adjust our own moral tuning. A feasible question along these lines might have been, do I, in a religious context, repent by sincerely uttering the words, "I repent"? Am I heartily sorry simply by saying in an appropriate situation that I am heartily sorry? Is this so even if I then amend my life? That last sentence is one of many moments when I, Helen, fear I am not sufficiently in tune with the way Iris Murdoch's mind works. I expect a different sequitur. Is this so even if I then fail to amend my life? But perhaps that would be the question of the theologian, not the philosopher, in search of a definitionally robust form of inwardness. Murdoch, at any rate, deems that ritual raises special difficulties. A more ordinary and everyday example is called for. So here is the example. A mother whom I shall call M feels hostility to her daughter-in-law, whom I shall call D. M finds D quite a good-hearted girl, but while not exactly common, yet certainly unpolished and lacking in dignity and refinement. D is inclined to be pert and familiar, insufficiently ceremonious, brusque, sometimes positively rude, always tiresomely juvenile. M does not like D's accent or the way D dresses. M feels that her son has married beneath him. Let us assume, for the purposes of the example, that the mother, who is a very correct person, behaves beautifully to the girl throughout, not allowing her real opinion to appear in any way. Whatever is in question as happening happens entirely in M's mind. Time passes, and it could be that M settles down with a hardened sense of grievance and a fixed picture of D imprisoned, if I may use a question-begging word, by the cliché, my poor son has married a silly, vulgar girl. However, the M of the example is an intelligent and well-intentioned person, capable of self-criticism, capable of giving careful and just attention to an object which confronts her. M tells herself, I am old-fashioned and conventional. I may be prejudiced and narrow-minded. I may be snobbish. I am certainly jealous. Let me look again. Here I assume that M observes D, or at least reflects deliberately about D, until gradually her vision of D alters. D is discovered to be not vulgar, but refreshingly simple, not undignified, but spontaneous, not noisy, but gay, not tiresomely juvenile, but delightfully youthful, and so on. I will have more to say about M and D in a minute, but let me start with the core claim here for what attention is and why Murdoch thinks we should afford it moral significance. Attention is the name she gives to a bestowing of careful and just thought on another person in a way that she wants to persuade us should count as moral activity, even though no further action may flow from it. Murdoch takes the term from Simone Weil, and Weil's influence is clearly audible in the essay's characterization of this scrupulous effort at thinking aright about someone else, not least the faint hint of religiosity, dampened but not eradicated by Murdoch, that makes careful and just sound only a slight skeptical nudge away from Weil's assertion that absolutely unmixed attention is prayer. As in Weil, attention looks rather like a quiet substitute for will, non-assertive, piecemeal, but directed mental activity of a specifically moral kind. The idea of perfection lays siege to a claim explicit in the work of Murdoch's contemporary Stuart Hampshire, but as she puts it, lurking behind much moral philosophy of the time, that morality, in order to count as morality, must be a matter of thinking clearly and then proceeding to visible action. Hampshire is indeed strict in seeking to distinguish something he is happy to call thought from daydreaming or musing or the drifting of ideas through the mind. In a sentence that may have had special resonance for Murdoch as a practicing novelist, he goes on to direct this definitional stringency specifically at the concept of interior monologue. The idea of a thought as an interior monologue will become, he says, altogether empty if the thought does not even purport to be directed towards its issue in the external world. In short, Hampshire leaves no space for an act of introspection that remains purely internal and non-objectifiable. Murdoch sets out to rescue that internality, the inner moral life, as she calls it, and to do so without objectifying it, without, for example, appealing to any kind of metaphysical witness for introspection, the eye of God, as it were, or giving introspection a hypothetical status that would render it cogent to a third-person view. If M were to speak her mind about D now, she would say different things. Hampshire is more an indicative than a representative adversary. A striking variety of philosophical opponents lines up beside him in the course of the essay. Old-fashioned empiricism, modern British empiricism, Kantianism, and above all, perhaps modern analytic philosophy. What they have in common, as Murdoch represents them, is a hostility to the notion of privacy, to history, and what often looks like a placeholder for both privacy and history, the complexity of lived reality. Wedded to an ideal of universal reason, their hostility to these things makes them incompetent to speak about important and large tracts of ordinary moral experience, especially those parts of our experience that have to do with difficulties in understanding, imitating, or orienting oneself in relation to public standards and rules. Existentialism, Murdoch credits with at least making an effort in the direction of restoring reflective interiority, but it falls short when it imprisons the individual in a relation with a very inflexible view of external facts. Above all, the idea of perfection sits in a love, it's not a love-hate relationship, but a love ambivalence, should we call it, relationship with Wittgenstein. Much more love than anything else, I think. Murdoch's desire to defend the notion of an attentive inner life is a moralist's reply to the Wittgenstein-assisted attack on privacy by many of the most influential philosophers of her time, an attack from which she exempts Wittgenstein himself, sphinx-like, reticent, she thinks, on the kinds of mental activity that interest her most. Murdoch has no compunction at all about muddying the waters of logical analysis by insisting that mental concepts enter the sphere of morality. This makes her, to many of her contemporaries' eyes, a very improper reader of Wittgenstein in ways that are both exasperating and fruitful. Improper, I should add, in a different way to several uses of Wittgenstein then and sometimes since, which have made the logician's "it is what it is" serve the purposes of disciplinary conservatism. Murdoch called herself a Wittgensteinian Neoplatonist, the best gloss I can suggest being that she espouses a view of metaphysics as a complex, continuous pictorial activity, a kind of secular novelistic substitution for metaphysics, but wants to keep on side with philosophy of language while forcing it to make a space for moral concepts as a special kind of psychological sense data. She once said that if she were shut up in prison for 10 years and told to write her philosophy, she could have a shot at explaining it, but it would take a long time. Her essay makes some quite shameless leaps from the philosophy of language and philosophy of knowledge to moral philosophy, shameless for its day, inducing an intense version of the giddiness Wittgenstein described as our characteristic human response to confronting the gap between what an empiricist can say about how our minds work and what it feels like to be inside them. That is, of course, a prejudicial description. It's hard to imagine the literary critic who, whatever their relation to Wittgenstein, will not think they ought to be voting with Murdoch on behalf of internality and the complexity of ordinary lived experience, whether or not they accept her way of going about things. Attention, as we've heard, plays an important role in the philosophical investigations. It's by clarifying the legitimacy of attention's scope that Wittgenstein is able to establish a difference in logic between mental states which cannot be direct objects of our attention and the things we can attend to, the sensory stimulus that gives rise to a sense impression, for example, or the verbal expression of a mental state. The privacy of your sensory experience or your psychological activity is an illusion. In Wittgenstein's account, you do not have access to it as you do to an object, only to the qualitative character of the external prompt or response. The colour red, for example, the howl of pain. Put simply, possession of a concept, any concept in the late Wittgensteinian view, is a public skill. The attack on the idea of a private language follows the rejection of the commonplace view that we use words as we do because we have direct knowledge of the sensations they stand for. If I cannot attend directly to psychological states, my own or anyone else's, it makes no sense to think of a language for my private sensations, which is understandable only by me. Murdoch does not want a private language, but she wants something quite close to it, a notion of internal attention to one's moral positioning, operative over long tracts of time, a life even that has no public expression. Moral concepts for Murdoch are things we apprehend, but the Wittgensteinian her agrees, not as objects. They come to us in the form of normative descriptive words, by means of which there takes place what we might call the siege of the individual by concepts. The words that interest her most are not the blunt moral instruments, good, bad, wise, evil, and so forth, but what she calls the specialized or secondary value words, vulgar, spontaneous, etc. Linguistic idiosyncrasy is for her the marker of a moral life more complex than a public reason's approach to morality would recognize, heavily context-dependent, historically embedded. Learning takes place when normative and specialized normative words are employed in contexts of attention, hence the importance of the M and D exemplar. What M is trying to do is not just to see D accurately, but to see her justly or lovingly. So far from claiming for it a sort of infallibility, this new picture has built in the notion of a necessary fallibility. M is engaged in an endless task. As soon as we begin to use words such as love and justice in characterizing M, we introduce into our whole picture of her situation the idea of progress, that is, the idea of perfection. It would be grist to Murdoch's argument that many of the terms by which M conducts her inner moral life have changed their connotations, if not their meaning, over the past 50 years. Common has a ring not just of snobbery now, but of antiquated snobbery, and so forth. Behaved beautifully sounds like a borrowed irony from Henry James, but perhaps it always did. The quality of attention called for on M's part, even without being able to second-guess language change, is high. Attention is self-critical, intelligent moral activity, a process of watchfulness over time in one's response to another person, gradually changing the initial perception of the other person, and in so doing perhaps rectifying an internal condition of injustice, a hardened sense of grievance, for example. It matters greatly that everything that is thought here about D is unverifiable. I'll go back to it. I'll go back to the beginning of it. The literary critic encountering M and D will reach immediately for the language of narratology as honed in the reading of moral realism. This is free and direct style, twisted in its philosophical purposes, so that the absence of an objective report beyond the character's plainly subjective, and to the reader, but not D, self-exposing prejudices, are working to expose M not to our judgment, but to her own. Murdoch, the philosopher, here argues for a version of the moral life that looks very like an internally scripted novel, never put on paper, about how morally thoughtful people develop over time, and how and why it may make sense to conceive of different moral temperaments. That is, a novel very like the ones Murdoch wrote. Murdoch's description of internal reasoning about morality places a high value on ability to wrestle with the language, though she does suggest that there are other ways of figuring an internal life, imagistically, for example. Not the least of her purposes is to find an account of moral activity that steers a course between total freedom in moral choice and total moral determinism. British philosophers tend to go with the first, she thinks, total freedom, assertion of the will in the moment of moral choice. Existentialists veer wildly between the two. Be that as it may, the internal work of redescription, revisualization potentially, figures as an exercise of freedom in the small piecemeal business of attention. Attention is a kind of moral preparation for life, which is why it's possible for Elijah Milgram to include the idea of perfection in a context where one might not expect it, a modern volume of essays on varieties of practical reasoning. What attracts Milgram about the essay is indeed the invitation to think of the building up of a conceptual toolkit as a kind of practice or moral expertise. There's something appealing about that thought. The most internal, self-scrutinizing, most self-scrutinizing, articulate people might turn out on this account to be thoroughly practical people. It's just that they haven't put their practice into the public domain. How philosophically satisfactory is a refiguring of Wittgensteinian attention as the psychological action of wrangling with moral concepts? This is where you're going to really regret that you asked me, because I'm going to go off message here big time. If you're a committed Wittgensteinian, it is undoubtedly problematic in the 1960s, the immediate reception of the pre-Cavell reading of Wittgenstein. In effect, what Murdoch has done is to take a term that has a definition in the late logic, attention as an aspect of the rule-based way we use words, emphatically not an inner analogue of pointing in John Campbell's careful elaboration, and asked it to comprehend a kind of moral activity that goes well beyond what a logical analysis can readily deal with. Although she's careful not to fall foul of the Wittgensteinian attack on thinking about concepts as middle-sized objects, it's hard not to think that she's teetering on the brim when she writes of moral concepts as things that lay siege to the individual. Valuing idiosyncrasy and the writerly process of wrestling with the language as she does, there is, it seems to me, a danger that the task of the wordsmith overtakes the task of the moralist. That is, that what's going on may be less moral than writerly. Protest though she does that M's thoughts need not be nearly as coherent as they are made in their hypothetical rendition as internal monologue, it's never very clear theoretically what a more shadowy wrestling with concepts would look like or feel like, and her allergy to certain philosophical uses of psychoanalysis seems to prevent her reaching out to the psychoanalysts for help. Not least with M and D in view, it's extremely difficult to imagine inner moral activity of this sort toward another without entertaining the possibility of some kind of subconscious leakage and responsiveness that will produce a feedback loop into the relationship. This is a difficulty Murdoch acknowledges but will not bow to. She labors strenuously to keep M's inner moral life free of external interference, and is particularly fierce in her strictures against the uses Hampshire and others make of Freud. She calls it a means of letting in the historical individual, but hoping by this means to keep him upon a lead. It's hard to know whether there is any irony in the suggestion, twice repeated, that it might help us to imagine that D is dead. If our lives are, as Murdoch is at pains to remind her fellow philosophers, thickly contextualized and historical, why is she so keen to keep the internal activity of any other equally complex person out of our heads? Reading Murdoch in the light of Wey looks equally problematic. I rather welcome the dampening of Wey's fervour, but that probably makes me a bad reader from a Weylian point of view. I don't feel inclined to be more attentive. Enough said. The idea of perfection is an old essay, and the opponents it has in view now seem rather remote enemies. The inheritors of the imperialist, hard, quasi-scientific attachment to rules, grammar, and a rigid universal idea of reason that Murdoch saw dominating philosophy generally, and moral philosophy particularly in the mid-1960s, now look less powerfully imperial than they were, which is a way of saying that moral philosophy is more plural now than it was in the early 1960s. In Oxford, at least, I strongly suspect one sense of that will be very dependent on the institution you inhabit. But reading the essay as an address to the Academy gives another character and address to its thinking about attention. The idea of perfection casts a very wide argumentative net, though it has at its heart the technical argument in defense of a notion of moral privacy. It's also a plea for restored attention on the part of the discipline of philosophy as a whole to large areas of inquiry that had, over recent decades, been widely deemed illegitimate. It's not irrelevant that she writes of attentive redescription as a moral discipline. If Stuart, Hampshire, and A.J. Eyre are indicative figures of what had gone wrong to Iris Murdoch's way of thinking in the pursuit of an impersonal world of language, G.E. Moore stands at the start of the essay as a figure of unjustly exiled intelligence, many of his beliefs philosophically unstateable now, she says. Murdoch detects an unlovely form of hostile narrow-mindedness here, a disciplinary tendency to determine that certain lines of inquiry are progressive, others regressive or assumed to be superseded. Here, as elsewhere, Murdoch thinks the humanities in the 1960s have been led astray by a model of progressivism taken from the sciences, so that retrieving G.E. Moore for serious consideration is looked on askance, as might be the case with a modern physical chemist taking up alchemy. We're well practiced as humanists in making the case for the retrieval of discarded texts, historical episodes, even whole bodies of intellectual labor or cultural practice. But broad disciplinary agreements about what is worth our attention and what is not are part of what the term discipline itself comprehends. To put the point morally, there is a difference between retrieval under the auspices of history and retrieval in good faith. Attention of the kind Murdoch gives to Moore is capable of redescription, I'm suggesting, as the public version of what she would have us understand goes on in the private life of the mind, careful and just thinking about another person's ideas, an attempt to wrest value from a context of prejudice in which the quality of the thought yielded through attention may be fallible, but is nevertheless perfectionist in its intent, striving continually at more accurate redescription. A stricter Wittgensteinian of her day would tell her that there is a problem with the word accurate. Accurate to what? How can we know? But that's accounted for in her modelling of moral concepts. It is, I think, not a small problem with this extrapolation from the moral attentiveness of private thought to the disciplinary attentiveness of intellectual study that the quality of the description Murdoch gives to the sciences is so plainly hostile. She is, it would seem, in the early stages of the mother-in-law relationship, so far as the threatening and historically younger other divisions of the university are concerned. This is not just her moral failing, as it were. I told you can regret inviting me. Assertions to the effect that the humanities, and perhaps especially literature, A, have a distinctive interest in the kinds of thinking that resist public rule-bound or otherwise normative agreements, and B, are in that sense better ethically oriented toward their subject matter than other divisions of the university, are still very much currency in our public debates, though not unchallenged. So B is so obviously shaky that I hope I can dispatch it with an opinionated sentence. Advocacy for the humanities that doesn't distinguish interest in ethics and ethical comportment, and doesn't distinguish between the laboratory sciences' commitment to method and the plural orientations of the sciences towards their conceptual content, isn't doing its job, I think. A is more interesting. The humanities are often deemed to be the intellectual home of a certain kind of resistance to public reasoning. Put so blankly, it's not a very helpful characterization. Far more true of certain fields of intellectual inquiry than of others, and in any context likely to be only partially true, not, I think, very true in this room. Murdoch puts the point more exactingly when she targets the kind of reasoning that assumes we can only work backward from public statements to individual discrepancies. Even this is, I think, a description we might be wary of. The problem's not that the orientation to a moral concept, validation of idiosyncrasy, is wrong, or even that the mother-in-law scenario is not a good basis for disciplinary moralizing, welcome though an injection of comedy might be. Rather, that resistance to public norms of articulation can only have very limited viability, I think, as a platform for defending what we do. It may have some appeal, not least in its perversity, but it won't be enough. So as part of a pluralist defense, fine. But as the thing itself, I'm worried. You'll be gleaning by now that Murdoch's essay makes claims on my attention that distract from its explicit purposes. The idea of perfection exemplifies for me a not unfamiliar problem, but in unusually stark form. What does it mean to read someone with whom we perceive ourselves to be out of tune? My desire to adjust an apparent non sequitur in Murdoch's brief consideration of ritual has numerous other counterparts in the essay. How can she put Wittgenstein and Weil together in such close proximity? Is there a glimmer of humour in the suggestion that Dee would conveniently be dead? I hope there is, but I honestly have no idea. How can she so easily knock the sciences into the back row by claiming that words trump ideas? It is and always will be more important to know about Shakespeare than about any scientist, she says. Her mind does not work as I want it to. I'm no doubt too rule-bound, even if in different ways from the rationalist's rule-boundedness that vexes her. Her philosophical writing is of that very, very idiosyncratic kind that pulls the reader up hard against their own disciplinary and sometimes moral anticipations of what academic writing should be, even with the very wide latitude academic writing can sometimes permit. This is no doubt more true because her primary audience is one versed in the technically restrictive requirements of philosophy of language. She's a formidable reader of Wittgenstein when she wants to be. And for them, even more than for me, she must seem prone to going dramatically off-piste. Iris Murdoch is dead. It helps to make this explicit. I do not owe anything to her morally in the sense that I owe something to anyone alive and with an immediate claim on my attention. So I'll end by asking, in the light of the idea of perfection, what the scope of morality is here. Murdoch asks me to consider that attention to writing that has been superseded is a moral activity, even if it does not leave my head. That it is an effort, however fallible, of justice and care. Let's say that I'm not on this occasion asking anyone else here to validate a public act of attention to the idea of perfection by bringing it back into current discussion. Milgram, I think, is taking care of that. There remains something to be said here about the psychology of intellectual labor, that we all engage in private acts of redescription towards the objects of our reading over long periods of time, much, indeed most of which will not make it into the public domain. I'm not entirely convinced, though I take it most people here are, that this is a moral activity, but it's certainly activity that can encroach upon morality. It's intellectual activity, an extended recalibration of description that becomes moral when it moves toward judgments of quality. And I think it's worth saying that Murdoch anticipates Cora Diamond in wanting to keep judgment at a distance. So you're not, in the act of paying attention, judging. You're doing the preliminary conceptual toolkit bit that may or may not one day yield a judgment. Okay, Wittgenstein's metaphor, continual retuning, is, I think, the best metaphor to be found for it. Thank you. Coffee. Just let people see the coffee, yeah. Shall I turn the screen off? Shall I turn the screen off? I'm on the Mac user. Just go that way. Mute it.
We see you.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Three amazing papers. We have about 20 minutes. Jeff?
I'm going to need all 20 minutes. Actually, this is a question for Nancy, and I've been tormented by your argument, and tormented by it in a good way, and I'm prepared to agree with it reluctantly. And I want to actually ask you if the following two, what's your main argument as far as I'm concerned? Your main argument as far as I'm concerned, leaving aside the Wittgenstein, the skepticism that you want to attach to the Eliotic jingle about her version of the problem of other minds, right? Mm-hmm. I'm with you there. That's not a problem. But the problem I have the hardest time with, as a confirmed Eliotic, is the notion that the narrator is one among many narrators, as it were. And I want to actually ask you to agree with you to see if these are, as it were, friendly amendments to what you're suggesting, or examples. Example one, it seems to me that there's a kind of affective motive in this. We could call it the solution of other minds. In other words, the notion of that I don't know what's going on in your mind. You don't. And if you think about the sort of fundamental emotional fact of the refusal of forgiveness in Eliot, Tom Tulliver, never mind Grandcourt, Adam Bede, up until only after he's killed his father can he forgive, right? Mm-hmm. That is to say, you stop, Arthur. Well, yeah, right? I mean, he says, stop, I've been harsh, too harsh. Basically, I waited until my father was dead. I mean, I didn't literally kill him, but you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. Gwendolen refusing to forgive Lydgate, et cetera, et cetera. All these moments, it's not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Think about the flood at the end of Mill and the Floss. Here's what I was thinking. That moment where Dorothea does what anyone does who really wants to stop fighting. Even though I'm still really pissed, I'm going to ask for forgiveness, right? Let me start. Let me throw it down here, and you come along too, right? Then now you do your job and say you're sorry too, right? None of that. right?
Right.
And then we go immediately into, from there we go to the bed and we go the roar to the roar, I mean, via the basilicas. We go to the roar on the other side of silence, right?
You know, the sequence in those chapters is so incredibly weird.
But
right?
play with me at least to this extent.
There's the scene of Dorothea crying alone happens, I think, 3 different times
Right.
over the course of the chapters. So
Yeah.
the forgive me
Yeah.
is really the culminating
Right.
sort of episode in that sequence.
Yeah.
So the roar is actually earlier.
Oh, I know, but as far as, but
Yeah, okay.
it's like, that's the prequel is, in other words, what's
Right.
leading up to that is, the roar on the other side of silence has been eventuated, produced by this, please forgive me, do you forgive me, and then you get that pompous non-forgiveness, just in terms of the sequence of the action. In other words, no? I mean, that's what the novel says.
I mean, if
She's
I'm
crying on the bed. How did we get here? We got here in the following way. There was this argument earlier in the day, da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah. So the forgive me is after, is temporally
Prior,
After.
narratively after.
narrative in the novel after.
Right, but the story,
Yes.
but you follow what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think so.
So what I'm suggesting is that one way to talk, it's like, good thing that there's the problem of other minds, because if there weren't for the problem of other minds, there'd be all this returning rage.
Right.
Right, point one. Point two, it seems to me that, that the notion that the narrator is constantly producing the sense of like, well, let's start again. Let's just say you're right. I think you are about the narrator being one of many sort of narrator voices. Contest of faculties: Bulstrode, Lydgate, the narrater. The narrator, as usual, when there's a contest of faculties, home court advantage, the home court wins. Bulstrode, excuse me, let's start with Lydgate, obvious example, lacks sympathy, right? Therefore, he goes down because he lacks sympathy. Rosamond, he doesn't realize that Rosamond's another being, right? So he lacks the narrator's sympathy, right?
Okay, go on.
Bulstrode
Right.
falls into a kind of a pre-panopticon situation. He can't, he sees into your life. Turns out you can see into his life too, right? Right, that's the problem. But with the narrator, she's sympathetic, but no one can see her. She's ontologically curtained from the character. No one's going to turn and say, well, how dare you pass all these judgments on us, you trollop, you're living in London out of wedlock with this other guy. So that also brings in this notion, suggests that as it were, a kind of a motive for whether it be a disciplinary motive, the realist novel versus whatever, a psychological, a motive for the notion of the problem of other minds, where the problem of other minds becomes the solution of other minds.
Right. Well, thanks for that. I mean, that's, it's really interesting. This is the first time that I've presented this material, and I realize it's a kind of complicated and counterintuitive argument that I'm trying to make about the novel. So I'm still, it's in development. Among the sort of, if you're proposing Lydgate and Bulstrode as sort of surrogate figures for the kind of narrative project, Bulstrode, Lydgate, Mary Garth, I would say there are multiple surrogates, all right? Lydgate is an interesting example. I mean, Lydgate's an interesting example because his project, right, his medical project, his scientific project, is, on my reading, closest to the kind of omniscient narrator conception. Because of the emphasis on penetration, right? To penetrate, to find the primitive tissue. So there's a really telling a line in the sort of description of Lydgate's project, where a voice that I don't think is the same as the problem of other minds narrator voice enters to say, well, he was after the primitive tissue. In that way, he put the question, not quite in the way of the awaiting answer, but doesn't that happen so often in inquiry? So I think For me, that's a sort of cue that the very mode of inquiry for which the omniscient narrator is providing answers is kind of under investigation in the novel. But there's so much more to talk about, so other people.
Brigu?
Hi. I'm an anthropologist, having recently completed a year of anthropological fieldwork on mental health and illness, in trying to understand what happens to households or families in the case of mental illness, the single most useful concept I've found has been Cavell's conception of the tempo of skepticism in The Claim of Reason, and skepticism as a concept, to understand certain doubts about existence. And his claim, it is absolutely the central principle in what separates Austin and Wittgenstein. And what struck me quite strongly is in each of the three papers here, we find a very different relationship to skepticism, or the conception of what is at stake. Because according to Cavell, philosophical investigations is written in continual response to the threat of skepticism and the idea that the world may dissolve. But in Toril's paper, it seemed almost like an academic, or it's written in argument with, you said, against certain kind of skepticism. But what is interesting to me in Cavell is that the argument with skepticism is something you can never win or lose, as he says. So I just wanted to draw out. So it seems to be a certain kind of argument in your case, a certain kind of opacity in the case of Nancy, and a certain something that can be overcome, a problem with respect to other minds that can be overcome, if I read one version or a form of what your example was doing, except interestingly in Cavell there's a tempo, it never quite goes away. It's not something that can be defeated in that sense. So I just wanted to draw out what each of your papers, how you would think of the problem of skepticism.
Okay, so I didn't see my paper as being an argument against skepticism in that non-Cavellian way at all. I think I only used the word once or twice, and then as a diagnosis. I'm just saying that certain theories of language are skeptical. They just are forms of skepticism. I was certainly not trying to persuade them or argue them out of their skepticism. In chapter 9 in my book, the key concept is acknowledgement. And for me, that scene that you quoted, first of all, I think the concept that really fits the scene where Casaubon, soi-disant, doesn't want to forgive her, well, she's actually fake here. She doesn't really want to be forgiven because Dorothea, it says, she's exaggerating her fault a little. So, and Casaubon can't forgive her, won't forgive her because we know what we know about Casaubon. But the point is, acknowledgement for Cavell requires not just that you understand how it is with the other, but that you acknowledge your own position in relation to them. And of course Casaubon can't do that, because he would then have to acknowledge how he is in relation to her. And she doesn't actually right there, she's asking for forgiveness because it's what the woman should do. She feels a bit bad, but so for me, the concept of acknowledgement is the one. That's not a concept that Cavell uses as a counter-argument to skepticism. I mean, you and I agree completely. It's a concept that he uses to show that there's a dimension of being with other minds that is not an epistemological one. The idea is not whether I can have 100% certain knowledge of what goes on in your mind. The idea is, can I acknowledge how it is with you? Can I acknowledge the plight of mind, your pain or whatever it is that's at stake right now? And it's not clear, and that doesn't turn on knowledge in the positivistic way. So essentially, I agree that you can't argue people into believing, the idea that it's the picture of what counts as knowledge of other minds that's wrong, Cavell shows us. The idea that it turns on 100% certainty, well, sure, we can't have that if your picture of certainty is a positivistic one. But acknowledgement is a live option and a moral claim on us. So essentially I agree. I didn't try to argue against skepticism in the slightest, and acknowledgement I could go on about forever.
I mean, I can only agree. I can only agree with you. I think acknowledgement is maybe the missing term in the question that you asked. And I guess maybe the one thing I would add is that in Cavell, acknowledge. I mean, you're quite right. It's a concept, or it's an idea that it is meant to suspend a question of an epistemological relationship to the other. Acknowledgement is something else, but it's also not always successful, right? So there are failures in there are failures in acknowledgement that are different than failures of knowing. They're failures of response. They're ethical failings, and in that sense, maybe that's what you mean by the tempo of skepticism that we live in relation to others. If we were all perfect in our acknowledgements, there would be no problems between us.
Yeah, that covers it. I'd only add what's really obvious is that I don't think what we need now is a turn against skepticism. I think we just need a better debate about what's a frivolous and what's a non-frivolous skepticism. Yeah.
I have Leela, and there's somebody at the back there. I'm not sure who your name is, and then Amanda.
I have a slightly inchoate question, I think possibly most directly for Toril Moy. Thank you all for your very stimulating papers. I just feel I worry, perhaps I feel skeptical about how much depends on figuring out the internal relationship of the somewhat frugal binary of word and world. Insofar as, word is also world and vice versa, and perhaps the same obtains for other binaries that came up in all of your papers, say a self and other, subject and object. And I wonder, which is why I'm directing this question to Toril Moy first of all, is whether in the OLP corpus, in the way that Ryle especially, it's not summoned often enough, gives up on referentiality without giving up on the real, that might we not be able to say that the case is being made for permutation as the means to provoking attention and being attentive. And by permutation, I mean when I say at this moment, jam tart, in this gathering, at this time, I mean jam tart, the thing. I also mean the expectation of shared hunger and low sugar levels, and I express a permutation. And that in every such case of OLP utterance, there is room for rather more complex permutations of things and selves and others and so on and so forth. That's it. Thank you.
Well, I always think it's hard to give talks where you hint at Wittgenstein's very rich vision of language. If I gave the impression that he operates with like two terms, word here, world there, and let us now intertwine them, then I'm very sorry, that's not the vision. So obviously I then failed to convey in very brief form what I wanted to say. It seems to me that in the tradition, as I understand it after Wittgenstein, Austen and Cavell, everything you want out of your jam tart and more is fully available in every conceivable way. That's the whole idea of words that are, or if you like, utterances that are at once actions and interventions and expressions and depend on who you're talking to, and they depend on uptake, and they depend on exactly the situations that's at stake. That's what it means to say that practices and utterances are, if you don't like the word world and word, I suppose one says it because it's both begins with W, which is one sort of pressure you can go for, then feel free to use others. The idea that there should be a binary at work here is like alien to me, and I can very well see that I could have given that impression, but that's not my view. The whole beauty of the vision of language here is one that takes you, obviously some things are binary opposites, but that's neither here nor there when it comes to understanding how language works. I mean, binary opposites are fine, but they're not the foundation of anything. And so, but then at the same time, I don't see any trouble in, say, talking about self and other, because sometimes we need to talk about self and other. Point here being that I think that this is precisely the kind of tradition that you're looking for, and I commend it to you.
Do you guys want to respond? So there are just three. I have three other people with questions. Can I ask you to each be fairly brief? And what is? It's you at the back. Yes.
I'll be very brief. This is a question that arose during Toril's talk, but if anyone has any thoughts, I'd love to hear them. One of the memorable aspects of Wittgenstein's investigations and of the Blue and Brown books for me is that recognition of what he calls the process of meaning words, the feeling with language, what he calls sort of the tune to language, the song that accompanies the process of meaning words as an important aspect of his understanding of language there. And I was just wondering how that comes into Toril, into your understanding of words sharpening our understanding of the world. Because if anything, and I may be wrong, this tune would seem to soften the understanding of the world rather than sharpen it.
Well, maybe we're not talking about the same thing, but when you talk about tune, I am thinking about attunement. Okay, sorry, I assumed you are saying attunement and, you know, language as attunement, which is Übereinstimmung, as we talked about. That comes in the paragraphs where he talks about how we agree in judgment but not in opinion. I don't see how that is connected for or against the sharpening of our understanding of words or the softening. In fact, I'm not even sure I know what a softening of, I'm not sure what you mean by softening. I would just say that what Wittgenstein wants from the attunement concept is the idea that I can't even quarrel with you if we didn't share criteria for when to deploy concepts. So that if I wanted to really slug it out with you over the idea of softening, say, something, I would have to understand what you mean by, how are you using the word softening here? And I'm not quite sure I got that. So also, the more, you know, Wittgenstein, I so agree with what you're saying. Wittgenstein begins by saying, you don't even have a philosophical problem unless you feel confused. Confusion, this fog we're in sometimes, the aim of that propels you into thinking. And then when you've done that, you will see clearly. This clear view or the perspicuous representation or survey is what he wants. I don't think there's anything in Wittgenstein to give primacy to the opaque or the unclear. But you see, he also says, sometimes what you want is a blurred picture. You don't always need clarity. You sometimes need subtle tact. Am I saying you should always define all your, I don't know, critiques of your friends as clearly and sharply as possible? know. But it's, you know, sometimes what you need is the blurred picture, and sometimes you don't. But that's not a theory. There's no theory here about sharpness or lack of it. And Wittgenstein's loved clarity. It was the goal of his philosophy.
You can just have the last two questions, maybe. Can you hear? Yeah. I was just thinking, I was fascinated by M and D. And I wanted just to know a bit more about why she stops. Does she stop the vignette there? Because if she does, it's odd that, and maybe this ties into the resistance to the psychoanalytical that you were talking about in her. She stops after she's made apparent progress from denigrating D to idealizing her. Is that right, roughly? She sort of says the movement is, I learn patience, I'm getting more just, I'm on the way to becoming more perfect by... I'm being slightly caricatured. But the question is really, why do you think Murdoch does not... Why is there the silence about why M might need to idealize? None of, say, there's no glimmer of the power that will be at stake in being charitable and feeling the power of that. Yeah. I don't know whether that ties into a larger argument, but it's just, there's a place where Murdoch says that attention is patience with the contingent. Yeah. But that didn't sound like it. That vignette sounds like stage to, I was bad then, and now I'm good, and I'm going to blanket off the unconscious. It's that my other motives for being able to pass my beautifully charitable judgment on D. Does that make...
It does, yeah. Are you collecting both at once?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Very quick, this is, of course, for Nancy. Thank you, the fabulous papers, great panel. You're being critical of the Middlemarch narrator, right? Because, I mean, part 3 is something, you know, part 3 was introduced as, you know, polyvocal ways of re-looking at things as we move along through the novel. But it seemed to me that you ultimately were giving a very sophisticated updating of the critique of the intrusively didactic Eliotic narrator. Or alternately, a kind of, there's also some sort of affinity between what you're doing and D.A. Miller's critique of the scenes of sympathy, right? Where there's like, this is what's really happening here. Impasse, egotism, you know, complex affect. Right. And I agree with you that it's really interesting to read the theoretical voice or voices of the narrators in relation to the embedded characters. I think that's a really fruitful way to read Eliot. But I was just wondering if you're ultimately also sort of saying the novel might be better without some of these.
No, I hope that's not what I was saying at all. I mean, I think that, I think the fact that that voice is there is crucial, and I mean, I hope I conveyed, I guess I didn't, you know, I hope I conveyed that, you know, I mean, I love the narrator. It's the swerve away, and I think what perhaps didn't quite come out in this paper as much as I hope it does in the longer version, is that the intense desire and temptation to embrace the narrator's insight. So it's difficult, and I think Wittgenstein says in one of the earlier drafts of philosophical investigations that it's hard to give up using certain combinations of words. That's a painful relinquishment. So yeah, I'll have to be careful of that in the later version of that.
Okay, so just M&D. The funny thing about Rita Felsky's just edited an issue of NLH on exemplarity, and the lovely thing about Murdoch's examples is all exemplars are spurious, right? But hers are knowingly spurious, so it doesn't function like internal monologue. Is the bottom line. Nevertheless, I'm going to give you an approximation to it, which is internal monologue. So the whole thing is falsely articulate from the start, and what she wants you to do is to pull out those second-order descriptive words and think that's where the moral tuning is going on. And the bit that's funny is that, but again, is she being funny? I'd love to think she's being funny. Is yes, it achieves a kind of perfectionist
here is an idealized version of my daughter-in-law in one direction, but that is itself supposed to be a fallibility, I think, because it's clearly self-serving in one kind of judgmental reading, but the entire thing is a second remove on a judgmental reading. So that's what gives it. She could have scripted it any which way. That's the whole point, that what she wants you to do is pull out those twiddling the dial words and see what's going on between them.
Could I just ask a quick question? Because the M&D story, isn't it just meant to counteract the idea that you don't have moral transformation unless you have action, so that it doesn't really much matter what transformation, I mean,
Non-action activity is what
yeah,
it
so
is.
because she's arguing against people like Sartre and Beauvoir, where you absolutely have to commit yourself to doing something in the world. And the whole idea is this woman sits there and is doing nothing, right?
Yeah.
She's just thinking. So from that point of view, it wouldn't matter what the details were, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
You
so
can just push it
the
around
question
anywhere
is
you go.
whether it works on that level or not.
Yeah.
So whether we think she's kind or narcissistic, as long as we think there's a change, Murdoch has got her point. Right?
Yeah.
Is that, is
A
that right?
non-visible change, something has
Yeah.
just happened inside the box, as it were, of internal monologue, where the box has the wrong label on it. It shouldn't be internal monologue anyway. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. 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 I think people need the jam tarts.
Yes, jam tart time. So we have 15 minutes, and we'll reconvene here at 4:05 for the next session. Thanks a lot again to our panelists.